The death, burial, and resurrection of Christ necessitates a missional mindset. By missional, the lifestyle means that we know the gospel, but we also live the gospel. The beginning of Christ, the existence of who He is, what He has done in our life, in the world, and everything else. Knowing the gospel, we must live the gospel, and we must be relational and intentional in what we do as Christians. I mean, everybody else is coming out of the closet. We might as well. I mean, we've hidden this thing as if we want to be so secretive or seeker-sensitive, and it's almost like we want to create a degree of ambiguity around the whole thing, keep people guessing, when in fact, when we look at the life of Christ, He was not only relational, He made it important, a high priority to build relationships with people, but He was intentional with His message. And I think our challenge today is, are we going to be missionally minded from what we understand about the Christmas story, the hundreds of years of prophecy about the Messiah that would come? Are we going to be intentional about what happens and what goes on? Well, the first thing I want us to talk about today of why His burial and resurrection is important. This is your first fill-in. It's important because it is essential. No other religious system, no other religious person, no other person, regardless of the religious persuasions, can claim the fact that that person, in our case, Christ, the Son of God, was not only lived, not only was buried, but was resurrected, witnessed by hundreds. Witnessed by hundreds. So the burial and resurrection of Christ is essential. The Bible says in Luke chapter 24, verse 44, that everything must be fulfilled that is written about me. And it goes on to look back, not only that, but in the law of Moses, the prophets, the Psalms. So if you have any question, as many do, and some religious people, regrettably, if you have any question about what the Old Testament has to say about Christ, look through it through the lenses of Christ and what He just said. That in the law of Moses, in the Psalms, and in the prophets, those persons wrote of me, and that must be fulfilled. The Bible goes on to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, that if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. Do you see how essential that is? It's not a multiple choice question. It's not a matter of, well, we'll take it or leave it. I mean, the idea that Jesus was not raised from the dead has been an argument all the way back to the New Testament days, popularized by the Sadducees, and even till this day, many, even in religious circles, question the fact that Jesus really was raised from the dead. It was just the figment of someone else's imagination, or it was the grandiose thinking of His followers that perhaps He would be raised. But the reality is, in the essential teaching of the New Testament about our faith in the burial and resurrection, it is essential to the point that it says Christ said it must be fulfilled, and that if it is not fulfilled, if in fact Christ did not rise from the grave, then our preaching, what we believe, our faith, is totally in vain. Do you see why it's important that we don't stop in Bethlehem? We can't stop in Galilee. We can't stop at the cross. We've got to go to the empty tomb, because if Christ be not raised, our faith is in vain. This is the teaching and the reality of the gospel. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And even though we be dead, or even though at one point we die, yet shall we live. And this is the hope of the Christian message. Well, the significance of his burial and resurrection is not only essential, but secondly, because it is experiential. This is your second fill-in. It is also experiential. The Bible says in Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. You see, the Bible says that I want to know the power of the resurrection, to identify with his death. Now, interestingly, that word for power is the word dunamis, from which we get the word dynamite. Now, the interesting thing about this concept, that I want to know the power of Christ, the power of his resurrection, I want to be identified with his death, very morbid to the modern mind. But the reality is that when the power of God comes into my life, the same power that raised Christ from the dead, then my life will, in an explosion, change. You see, if you have found your way to the Bethlehem stable, if you found your way to be enamored by the teachings of Christ in the Galilean ministry, and if somehow you found the reality of Christ's death on the cross, and even when you get to the point of finding an empty tomb, has it experientially changed your life? After all, if we just live our lives on religious facts and religious practices, and all we get is just simply the historical truth of Christ and who he was and why he came, then we'll never get to the point that that message, that person, that event, God sent Christ into my life to dunamis, to explode for the power of Christ to change me. Now, think with me just for a moment. Many times when they clear highways, they have to remove mountains of rock. And they'll drill holes and they'll drop dynamite. And when they ignite the dynamite, what happens? It totally explodes and it changes forever the landscape. They do it by layers, and as they drop the dynamite in the holes, they blow away a whole section of rock, and they'll keep going and going until they have it to the length and to the width that they desire. That said, there is no way under heaven, and this is the call, I think, to the Christian community.